Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are diving into a truly fascinating piece of history. We're going to unpack how a military dictatorship managed to pull off what is arguably one of the greatest ideological heists of all time. We're looking at how the Tokugawa Shogunate didn't just conquer Japan with swords and armies, but how they actually managed to reprogram the minds of the people they were ruling. To get us started, picture this scenario. You're Tokugawa Ieyasu. You've just conquered Japan through brutal, absolutely unrelenting warfare. Your hands are proverbially, well, actually, literally, covered in blood. So how on earth do you convince the masses that you suddenly have a divine right to rule? How do you pivot from being a violent warlord to a legitimate, peaceful sovereign whose family is going to rule completely unchallenged for centuries? Section 1. The Tokugawa problem, from warlord to legitimate ruler. To figure out how they solved this ideological puzzle, we first have to look at the massive political headache the newly established Tokugawa Shogunate was dealing with. You see, right before the Tokugawa took over, Japan was trapped in the Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States period. This was roughly a century and a half of pure chaos, volatile warfare, and constantly shifting alliances. But then, in 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu takes power and establishes the Bakufu, or military government. Coming out of all that bloodshed, the new regime desperately needed a way to lock in an era of unbroken peace. And they actually pulled it off, creating the Edo period, which lasted all the way to 1867. By 1790, their grip on the ideology was so intense, they literally outlawed any teachings that didn't perfectly match their narrative. So, here's their ultimate dilemma. Ieyasu got his power by conquering other rulers, right? And in the eyes of traditional philosophy, overthrowing a king, committing regicide, was a massive, unforgivable sin. He was basically looking for a philosophical hall pass to justify what he'd done, lock in his family's future, and entirely silence any dissenting voices before an uprising could even cross their minds. Section 2. Hacking Chinese Philosophy, the Blueprint for Control. Instead of relying on what was already there, like the native Shinto religion or the dominant Buddhist traditions, Ieyasu looked across the sea to China for a brand new bureaucratic blueprint. And what he found was shushigaku, which is the Japanese term for Neo-Confucianism. Now, this is an interpretation of nature and society that heavily, and I mean heavily, emphasizes social order, human relations, and moral cultivation. The shogunate looked at this Chinese system and saw enormous potential, mostly because it had just successfully guided China out of its own era of chaos. But there was a catch. The original Chinese source code of this philosophy was fundamentally peaceful. It heavily disliked violence. So for a strict military government to use it, that source code needed to be severely hacked. Section 3. Seika adapts the code, patching the philosophy for the shogun. This brings us to the very first architect of our ideological heist. Enter Fujiwara Seika. Seika was a former Zen Buddhist monk who stepped away from his religion to literally translate and adapt these ancient Chinese texts for Japan. Now, the original Chinese teachings from the great scholar Zhu Xi basically said a ruler must guide and educate peacefully. He explicitly disliked violence, warning that it might force compliance, but it's never going to win hearts. But when Seika adapts a text called The Great Learning, he writes in this massive philosophical patch. He essentially says that if people don't follow instructions and disrupt human relationships, well, then it is necessary to have punishment and the use of military force. It's brilliant, really. Seika hacked the peaceful teachings to give the shogunate exactly what it needed: total moral justification for using military might to enforce the law. And to make absolutely sure this hacked morality kept everyone in line, Seika championed an incredibly rigid, immobile class system to just freeze society in place. It was called the Four Occupations. You had the samurai at the top, then farmers, artisans, and way down at the bottom, merchants. Seika explicitly stated that anyone trying to jump to a different class, or anyone who didn't fit into these four boxes at all, was an outcast and should be banned. This gave the Tokugawa the exact ethical metaphysical blueprint they needed to lock down their society. Section 4. Razan sells out, the human drama of Hayashi Razan. Now, while Seika wrote the code, he actually refused to work directly for the shogun. The true architect of the day-to-day bureaucratic control was his prodigious young student, Hayashi Razan. And Razan's story involves this deeply fascinating, incredibly human moral dilemma. We actually have letters he wrote back to his master, Seika, and they are so revealing. He writes, "I agree with the current customs and consent with an impure age, and pretend that I do this for the sake of harmony. My spirit is wilting. You can feel the intense internal conflict here, right? He desperately wanted to be a pure Orthodox Confucian sage, but instead, he's working for a violent samurai warlord, feeling like a massive hypocrite. He knew he was compromising his core ideals. So why didn't he just quit? Well, he basically admits it. He says, "However, I hold the keys of the library in Sunpu, the happiness of reading a book I have not yet read." Ultimately, Razan totally sold out. Having unlimited VIP access to the shogun's massive library, endless resources for his studies, and this cushy, highly prestigious government job, it was just way too good to pass up. He traded his absolute moral purity for unprecedented intellectual power. And honestly, he definitely earned his keep. We have records of Razan directly answering the shogun's biggest anxieties. Ieyasu literally asks Razan, point blank, if violently overthrowing a ruler was an evil act. Razan does some absolutely remarkable mental gymnastics here. He rationalizes the whole thing, arguing that if a conqueror removes a wicked ruler without egoist desires and does it simply to save the people, well, then it's not the sin of regicide at all. It's a legitimate mandate from heaven. Boom. With that one argument, Razan handed Ieyasu the ultimate philosophical absolution for his violent past. Section 5. The perfect control system, locking in the Edo period. With the philosophy completely patched and the ideology monopolized through the Hayashi family's government academies, the Bakufu had officially won the battle for the mind. But to truly lock in the Edo period, they needed absolute physical control to match. Enter their absolute masterpiece of political engineering, the sunken kotai, or alternate attendance system. This required all the feudal warlords, the daimyo, to commute and live in the shogun's capital of Edo every single other year. And their families? They had to stay in Edo full-time as literal hostages. It was an ingenious system. It kept the warlords under the shogun's watchful eye, and, maybe more importantly, it completely drained their finances through the ridiculous costs of this constant, lavish commuting. They basically made sure these guys never had the cash to fund a rebellion. When you step back and look at it, it's a brilliant three-step formula for absolute power. Step 1, justify your violent takeover using heavily modified Neo-Confucian texts. Step 2, lock the general population into immobile classes so everybody knows their place. And Step 3, control the dangerous warlords physically and financially through the sunken kotai. By systematically combining a rewritten moral code with strict physical and economic control, they literally engineered over 2.5 centuries of unbroken stability. So the Tokugawa didn't just conquer Japan. They fundamentally reprogrammed its ideological operating system. They replaced Buddhism with this carefully curated synthesis of Neo-Confucian ethics and authoritarian rule. They took a philosophy that was originally meant to nurture and educate, and they transformed it into a rigid system designed to demand absolute loyalty, validate military power, and basically freeze a dynamic society perfectly in amber. Which leaves us with a pretty wild final question to ponder. Looking back at how seamlessly the Tokugawa edited a foundational philosophy just to serve their own political survival, what modern ideologies or moral codes or even societal norms do we follow today that might have been quietly edited by whoever is currently in charge? It really makes you wonder how often our deepest beliefs have been shaped not by some untainted divine truth, but by a very pragmatic, highly successful political heist. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll catch you next time.